Hello, everyone. I'm Mick Kennedy with Clef Books, and I'm so pleased to have with us today George Drew, who was the first person that I published through Clef Books with his wonderful volume titled Hog, a Delta Memoir. And we're taking this occasion to get to know George a little bit more, and also because he is judging Clef Books Sophomore Chapbook contest. So this will allow folks who are interested in maybe entering that contest to get a little glimpse behind the great mind that is one George Drew. So George, you've been doing okay, sir?
Yes, sir, I have. Been really good.
Well, the first thing that I wanted to ask you is just about how the book Hog came into being. If you could kind of elaborate a little bit on the creation of that volume.
Sure. The book itself really is just kind of an outgrowth of a lot of years of writing about my childhood, early adolescence, early adulthood. I write a lot of Southern material because I was born and partly raised in Mississippi, although I live in New York now and have for many years. And that's one way of keeping my Southern roots alive and exploring that whole part of my life. So the book itself basically, um, those were just disparate poems along the way, and then I decided, well, they would make an interesting chapbook, and then perhaps later a section of a full collection. So I started thinking that way and started playing around with the poems, and the basic ordering of the book is pretty straightforward. It's pretty much chronological. It goes childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, opens with a poem about that early childhood, and then it ends with a poem that goes back to that, um, that has to do with music. Because my Southern heritage for me is all about the musicality of the language and the mythology generated by Mississippi, that the South, Faulkner, all of that. So that's pretty much how it came about, and I just played with it, and it just kind of emerged as I think most writers, poets find when they're putting together a book, that it's one of those things that's inchoate. At the beginning, you don't even know what you're doing, but then the poems start to guide you and lead you, and I just pared away at it, got the poems positioned where they could play off each other as well as I could make them, and yet you had the chronology of the book as well. So that's pretty much how it came about, Nick.
Well, I really like the stories that you tell. Your lyrics are really beautifully rendered and so forth. Did you have anybody in your youth who you kind of listened to and kind of got this feeling about how to tell a story?
I think that's almost in my DNA because I know growing up in the South, everybody told stories. I think there's a just a kind of narrative gene or something that's at work there. And that's one side of my work, certainly. I mean, there is a large narrative component, but there's also just a straight component. And I think lyricism is all about your emotions, whereas narrative is anchored by the chronology, the story, and the characters itself. So I think that's probably where that comes from for me. I think I owe my Southern heritage quite a bit. Uh, I guess that would be my answer to that question.
Do you remember the first poem you ever wrote?
Oh, indeed I do. Indeed I do. I had just turned 20 years old, which was November 3rd, 1963. And we all know what happened November 22nd. Now, I had always been interested in writing, but I never even thought about poetry. Um, at Oregon State, where I went my freshman year, Dr. Marty Ludwig was my comp teacher, and he was the first one that really turned me on to poetry at all. You know, we read Frost, people like that, Eliot. And then when I transferred to the State University of New York at Albany, I met one of my professors was Dr. Harry Staley. Both those gentlemen have died. Um, And I took a course, Introduction to American and British Poetry. And then I really started getting steeped in that. So anyway, I was working part-time for McKesson and Robbins, the drug manufacturers, one of their factories, their plants in Albany. And they had a conveyor belt and you would put products, orders in baskets and they would shoot on up. It was quite an interesting experience. But one day, and I was there on the 22nd, and an announcement came over the speakers, and it said, the president has just died and he's been killed. And I thought they were talking about the president of McKesson and Robbins. And there was this group of women there, and they just started going absolutely bonkers, as the Brits would say. And I didn't know what was going on. And then finally, I asked somebody, and they said, well, President Kennedy has been assassinated. And riding the bus, the city bus, back to my dorm, I was just overwhelmed. So, like everybody, I was a ball of confusion, as the Temptations would put it. And I had to have a way of expressing those emotions. And I thought, well, poetry, I think I'll try that. So I wrote a poem about the assassination. And the Atlantic Monthly in those days had a column. It was called The Young Poets. For unpublished, they were trying to, cater to young talent, that type of thing. Well, in my youthful ignorance, I thought, well, why don't I just send this out? I mean, the Atlantic, everybody reads that. I didn't know anything about marketing. So I sent it. Peter Davison was the poetry editor there. And lo and behold, a week or two later, which was normal response time back in those dinosaur days, I got this rejection slip back, but with a note. And the note said, George, he said, you obviously are a young man with talent, he said, for poetry. Now you have to go out and learn how to be a poet. So I never forgot that, and that's precisely what I did. So I had been majoring in uh, elementary ed, and I lasted 2 weeks, and I thought, well, I'm going to switch and become an English major, and that's how it all started, and I went from there.
That's a great story. Uh, I'd like to pause right now, if you don't mind, and I think we have a couple of poems that you can share with us.
Sure, be glad to. Uh, this first one I'm going to read because I can't miss this opportunity to read this poem. It's a poem I wrote back, I think, in the 70s, and it's included in my first volume, which is a book called Toads in a Poison Tank, at which a lot of people will giggle, but actually it's a line from Child Roll into the Dark Tower Came, Browning's amazing, I guess we would call it this post-apocalyptic poem. And it's an incredible poem, by the way, very long one. And that's where the title came from for the book. Now, this poem, you'll see why I want to open with this, because it has to do with your state, Kentucky, and a writer that I read when I was a teenager that I loved. This is called Gone Now, an elegy for a Kentucky son. I've read him only once, in '57, when I was 14, and to this day I can't recall the stalls and dodges of the plot, but can my being kicked by it as if it was a mule got loose in Mr. Baker's collared patch, and plumb put off by the idea of Mr. Baker chasing him back out. I was in ninth grade then, Glen Allen Central High, and I remember reading it in study hall, a novel name of which I can't recall, excepting it was all about a hill boy who could spit tobacco true enough to hit a possum's eye at 20 feet. I laughed at a full gallop all that week, reading it between the pages of Math 2 up on the makeshift stage that was the study hall. And once, so hard, the tears near ruined my civics theme and brought Miss Kettledrum running like some old steer. I've only read him once, But certain things remain. Kentucky in the moonlight, vines on which his hero swung over the steep ravines, the hounds' fox flushing song, the campfires, and the men deployed around them while the dogs bawled and the coffee ran. He was a friend, gone now, this man who I bet dressed in denim, cords, and wool, who dressed his words that way, words that put laughter back in the fallow Delta days and sweet gum in the nights as sassy as the shine he loved so much to talk about. And that's how I remember him, this teller of Kentucky yarns, this poet of persimmons, chronicler of the Kentucky sod, this gentle miller of the word, who way before the dirt had time to settle like a flock of geese, preached sprightly of the long Kentucky spring. In memoriam, Jesse Stewart. This next poem is included in Hogg. It comes near the end of the book. The end of the chapbook, I get the poems basically ars poetica, music and poetry both, and or TV in this case. I think people of a certain age will relate to this. This is called I Remember Gunsmoke. I remember Gunsmoke. Marshal Matt Dillon squaring off with a bad hombre, slapping leather, sometimes slower but never missing, aiming for a shoulder or a leg, rarely shooting to kill. My first gun was a 410, perfect for knocking off Mississippi squirrels and doves, and not much kick. Then came a 20 gauge, 16 and 12, my favorite, my stepdaddy's Remington, a sleek and powerful 16 gauge, equally efficient whether using regular shot, buckshot, or slugs. I had no truck with pistols. Shotguns and later high-powered rifles were for my brother and me our rite of passage into Southern manliness, rules governing upkeep, use, and safety, the catechism we learned from the start. Losing sight of them meant losing our guns. My brother, still living in Mississippi, owns guns, but I live in the North and own none, though today they are everywhere, gun sales having ramped up exponentially in recent months, according to gun control advocates, various watchdogs, and the national news. Fear motivates, and there's a lot to fear in our world, but fear destroys worlds too. Mine was by looking down the barrel of my stepdaddy's Remington 16 gauge one black moonless night deep in the Delta. Guns are sexy, aesthetic, and powerful, hard to say no to, especially for lost men like my stepdaddy, men with demons to slay. Today, there are a lot of demons for a lot of men. Matt Dillon, where are you when we need you?
So last year you came out with this book, which is just fabulous, called Just Like Oz, out of Madville Publishing. Um, and in it, you were taking on and writing to and also about some of the poems and some of the poets that you like and hold close to you. Uh, and it may be a cliche question, but I'm always interested in how we as writers, how we take something away from looking at other people's work and so forth. And maybe you could just touch on how some of these uh, wonderful writers influenced your own work.
Well, let me, as an illustration, all, most of those writers that I'm talking about there, I knew. Uh, a couple of them were, one still is, well, there's more than that, but a couple or three of them are really still very good friends. But I'll focus on one writer for this, Alan Hoey. That actually is the longest essay in the book, and there's a long poem for him too. Um, Alan lived in Pennsylvania, although when I met him at a writers' conference in New York, and that was back in 1985, I believe, 84 or 85, and we just clicked, and we became really allies, buddies, friends. We did a lot of readings together. Well, he was also kind of in those days, I mean, it was like, I guess, sort of like bass clef. It was, it was a one-man operation. And anyway, he heard me read a couple of poems, and we became acquainted, and things started flowing, through letters and that type of thing. And then he offered to publish a book of mine. So that's how Toads in a Poison Tank came about. Alan actually published it. Anyway, Alan left New York, and he ended up teaching at Bucks County Community College, where I went later in the 90s on exchange. I spent a semester teaching there. Good friends in that area, Chris Bursk and others. And Alan, unfortunately, he had a heart condition, and he died uh, in 2010 of a heart attack. He was only 50, I think he was about to turn 57 years old. So his work influenced mine in one very important way. Um, he really spurred me to turn my attention to dramatic monologues as a form. And I've done a lot of that. My book on Michelangelo and my physics book both exercise dramatic monologues, to say the least. And I owe him that because it really opened up narrative to me and characters and all of that. I always loved the form anyway when I read, Tennyson, Browning, Pound, Eliot, people like that, Frost. So that very specifically, I think, is one answer to your question. We were great friends, and he was a brother, let's put it that way. And I really miss him to this day. Um, the other member of that little triad, I like to call it, was David Dooley, and there's an essay on him. David lives in California now, and he and I also have remained extremely close, and we dedicate stuff to each other, that type of thing. So yeah, there's that. Now, I mean, some of the other writers in there, Jack Butler, we have corresponded for several years now. I feel like I know him, and yet I've never met him in the flesh. But he's supplied blurbs and that type of thing. I've done, of course, there are, I think, a couple of essays in there that deal with his work. So I just really admire those poets that I've covered in there. So that's how that came about. I think that illustrates, I hope, for your question.
Yes, indeed. Uh, would you like to read a couple more poems?
Sure, I'm always up for that. Uh, uh, that is, after all, what this is all about, ultimately. Not me so much, but it's about the work. It always is. Anyway, this poem is also from Hogg. I wanted to read at least a couple from that, and then I'll end. In fact, I'll hold off on the other one. Well, I'll put that toward the end of the interview, and that's a great way to close out. You'll see why. Um, but this poem kind of swings back in a way, and all the trauma of my childhood and adolescence because of ultra-violent stepfathers and that type of thing. We won't go into all the specifics of that, but that defined about 10 years of my life. And uh, and then I got to thinking, I've written venomous poems and, I hate you, that type of thing. This is what you did to me, poor me. And I got tired of that. And I thought, well, what did they do that's positive for me? And they did one overriding thing for me, these damaged men. So this is kind of a synopsis of the bad stuff, but it turns at the end. So I think it's a good poem to read. It's kind of an ars poetic in a strange way. This is called I Never Thought I Would Say This. I never thought I would say this, but thank you, Gus. Not for the rage you brought my sister, brother, mother, and me. not for the late night terror attacks, not for the hard days of labor you exacted, not for the sunburned backs the barn stacking of hay bales brought, not for the alcoholic fist on our mother's chin. And thank you, Bert, but not for the trauma you brought us, not for the army belt on our backsides and its red welt reminders, not for the booze fueled abuse, the threats, the fear, not for the slap across our mother's face. No, I thank you both for something else, for the personal drive, for something more, for college and the career it spawned, for the first marriage that broke down, for the second that keeps on going, for the skills you taught me, Gus, like horseback riding, hunting, and fishing, and you, Bert, the love of big band music your black sax instilled on Sunday afternoons. I thank you for all of those, but even more for the abhorrence of bullies you engendered in me, for the hatred of domestic abusers and their tools of abuse, and above all, for my deep rooted need of what I've so ardently courted ever since you left my life poems, those lettered beauties. I never imagined saying it, but thank you.
So, kind of circle back. We were talking about just like Oz and some of the relationships you've had with these different types of writers and thinkers and so forth. And I really think that's important to have a community of writers, especially. It seems like today there's such an expanse of places to be published, uh, and there isn't, I guess, if I could say, the quality of poetry that I'm seeing is not where it once was because uh, people are just kind of out there creating for their own sake. They're writing out of themselves instead of trying to really engage the world and so forth. So for the young folks, truly, how important is it to have people who are well regarded as poets and who really know what they're doing?
Oh, that's everything. That is everything. I think in the development of a poet, you start out imitatio. I mean, you imitate, you find writers you love. I mean, I wrote the first 7 or 8 years, nothing but traditional verse. And I'm really happy now that I did that because it's allowed me to move into open forms and yet exert that kind of control. It also fine tuned my ear to rhythm, internal, and whether it's at the end of lines or internally within the poem. So I do think that that's extremely important. And by the way, I'd like to respond to that point you made about the poetry out there not being maybe always up to snuff. Well, I think that's a normal part of the democratization of anything. And certainly in my lifetime, over the last 40, 50 years, boy, has that occurred with a vengeance. And I think social media has a lot to do with that too. I mean, you can get published no matter what the quality is somewhere online. I mean, there's a jillion mags out there now and journals and that type of thing. So you can do it. Now, I think that's good because it's better people are writing poetry than out there throwing bombs or something. That's how I look at that. And even if you're not all that talented, what you're going to get back from that process is really important because I think it civilizes, it humanizes, it gives us more empathy, certainly has me. And I think other writers as exemplars of that are really important. Yeah, we know early, like with Eliot, the anti-Semitism he's been accused of and all of that. Well, we have to separate that out somehow because that was part and parcel of the time. He wasn't alone in that. H.L. Mencken. I mean, ugh, are you kidding? That was just the coin of the realm at the time. And besides, I don't think we can criticize too much here, given our history with African Americans and all of that. So anyway, I think I just think as role models, I think you have to have that. I know I'm mentoring a few people now, and although I like to point out to them, I'm mentoring you, but unbeknownst to you, you're also mentoring me. Because sometimes they write amazing stuff and I'll get inspired by that. So I think it's a dialogue, Mick, the kind of thing you and I've engaged in and are doing right now. It's a dialogue. I think it's always a dialogue. And if you don't keep that open, you're closing yourself off. I mean, all writers have maybe a handful of themes, but you need to broaden out. I don't always write just from personal experience. That's the reason I got into the physics thing and Michelangelo and Renaissance art and all of that, is it took me out of myself in a way. I mean, I'm there, but objectively, I'm writing about another world, other people, other characters, that type of thing. So I think that's extremely important. I'm glad you brought up that point, actually.
And I truly appreciate your response. That was awesome. Um, I was more of a mind, if I could kind of rephrase it a little bit, is you have, and yes, I totally agree. I love that people are out there and they are working and trying to create something. That is one of the most beautiful things that we can do. Um, but I was thinking more along the lines of some of the young folks that I have run into and have talked to, where they have surrounded themselves with people who cannot properly guide them on how to improve their stuff. So everything is just
Right.
great and wonderful and so forth, without getting some of that really good constructive criticism. And so
Yeah.
you're talking about mentoring and so forth. Would you like to elaborate a little bit more on that? The teaching aspect, if you will, and how teacher becomes student?
Oh, sure. I think, by the way, that problem that you're putting your finger on, that we enclose ourselves in our own little universe or world, and obviously it's human nature. You're going to seek out people who agree with you, that don't disagree. And isn't that the problem in our politics and our so-called cultural wars right now? Nobody's talking, nobody's listening. And I think that's the whole notion for me. I mean, I was a classroom teacher for 30 plus years. I don't do that anymore, but I'm still a teacher. I'm a teacher for life, and I teach through my work. I teach through mentoring. The advantage of mentoring, by the way, is you can take a student at a certain point, and over a period of, a long period of time, you can actually chart their growth. I mean, when you're teaching classes, you've got what, 16-week semesters or something, right? And then some of them, that's it, they're gone. You mentor them for that time, try to teach them. But I think young poets, if they're really serious about being poets or writers or artists or whatever, they need, if they get the opportunity, to attach themselves to someone. It doesn't have to be one person, but to some teacher, some writer, some poet who will take them under their wing basically and guide them and teach them. I don't see any. I think I think one thing about a lot of people writing poetry today is it's easy, it's quick. I mean, writing a novel is a much more complicated, in a different way, in the sense of just physical stamina to keep at it for years sometimes. Everybody can sit down and write a song lyric. You can sit down and write a poem. But to write a really good poem, or God help us, try to write a great one, uh, that that takes a lot, and you have to learn, you have to grow, and there's only one way to do that. I mean, you have to have models, and you have to have people who relate to what you're trying to do and say, yes, this is good, but if we go over here, you can make it better. Now, if the person's not willing to listen to that, they're thin-skinned and they reject everything you're saying, then, well, it's time to just move on. I don't know any other solution for that, because sometimes you do run into that with students, right? I've had them. I mean, just absolutely resistant to criticism at all, which of course tells you implicitly a lot about their psyches. Who knows their backgrounds, what gets them to that place? I don't think it's always arrogance. I think it's just insecurity, because the more insecure you are, the less inclined you are to accept criticism. Learn to accept criticism. I get it. I get it. I have friends we sweat and we criticize the hell out of each other. I get it from editors like you, and I accept that. I listen. I look it over. I don't always agree, but I would say 75 to 80% of the time I do. I learn something from it. So that would be my take on that. Yes, mentoring is important, very important.
Well, I appreciate all the support you've showed me, and your mentorship. Your mentorship is valuable to me as well, and everything that you've been doing for Base Clef Books. I appreciate you so much. You have a couple other poems that you want to finish off with?
I've got one here I'll do. Yeah. I want to take you to Maine. I thought, let's get out of the South. Let's get away from hogs and, buttermilk and all of that. Um, I think this is an interesting poem. We go up to Pemaquid every year. I've got a long association with Maine that goes back to 1980. I've house sat there. I've done readings at several of their universities, that type of thing. And we have good friends. And we go up to Pemaquid, which is right mid coast range area right there, over from Damerabascata. It's just gorgeous. I love it up there, and it's the ocean is very inspiring for me. It turns me on creatively. Anyway, one day I was sitting on this bench looking out at Muscongas Bay, which is, of course, the Atlantic Ocean right there. And I looked around and I saw this guy. He was walking up a dirt path that brings you into the cliffs where I was. And this poem will outline how I reacted to him. Never said a word to him or anything like that. This is called Jesus on the Coast. So there I was, stationed on this bench, overlooking Muscongas Bay, and feeling pretty damn blessed already. The day was to kill for. Early September in all its glory. Azure skies, white halos of cumulus clouds, cormorants sunning themselves on rocks, a gently cool breeze off the ocean, white caps, gulls, and a solitary aster gracing the scene. Blessed, as I say, and then I saw him striding along the dirt road back of me, feet sandaled and body swathed in synthetics, long blonde hair flowing behind him as he strode. And when he looked at me, his eyes divinely cosmic, like the ocean, like the sky. All in all, your stereotypical Jesus depicted in millions of paintings, millions of statuettes. And then he passed, and there I was, disciple on a bench, saviorless again, and staring down the ocean, staring down me. That's Jesus on the Coast.
Well, thank you so much for taking time out with us today, George. I really appreciate it and always love hearing you read. And we will be working on trying to get you to come down here more localized, and so that you and I can read together with maybe a couple other people from Base Clef Books. I think that'd be really exciting.
Well, I look forward to that particularly. It would give me a chance to, warn you that when you call me your mentor, you might come to regret that. I never thought of myself as your mentor, Mick. Sorry.
Well, you have influenced me in a lot of different ways, so that's definitely
Well,
mentorship.
let's just call it mutuality and let it go at that.
Mutuality, okay. Mutual fun.
Thank
Thanks
you. It was
again,
great.
George. I appreciate it. And thanks for everybody who's going to watch this. And I will see you all soon.
Yep. Keep writing, big brother.
Thank you.